My brother Jake always said I was the toughest person he knew. He said it the first time I came home from basic training, standing in our parents' driveway in Dayton, Ohio, with my head shaved and my boots still dusty from Fort Jackson. He looked me over, nodded slowly, and said, "You actually did it, Sarah." Not surprised exactly, more like proud in that quiet way Jake had about him, like he'd always known I would and was just waiting for everybody else to catch up. He was 26 then. I was 22. He had already done one tour in Iraq and was preparing for a second. We were the only two military people in our entire extended family, which in our house meant we spoke a language nobody else around us fully understood. Inside jokes about MREs and early formations. Shared eye rolls when relatives asked if we'd ever shot anybody. A particular kind of silence between us that said more than most conversations do. I want to ask you something before I keep going. Have you ever stood in a room full of people who share your blood and felt more alone than you ever did overseas? Because if you have, then you already understand most of what I'm about to tell you. Jake died on a Tuesday in late February. Roadside device outside Kandahar. His unit said he didn't suffer. I've heard enough military condolence language to know that sentence means different things depending on who's saying it. But I chose to believe it anyway because the alternative was unbearable. He was 29 years old. He had a laugh that filled whatever room he walked into and a terrible habit of eating cereal directly from the box without milk, which I gave him grief about until the very last time I saw him. I was stationed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base when the notification officers came. I saw their car pull up from across the parking lot and I knew before they even stepped out. That's something nobody prepares you for. The way your body understands things before your brain catches up. The funeral was scheduled 10 days later. Military honors, full ceremony, burial at the Veterans Cemetery outside Dayton. My parents handled most of the arrangements with help from Jake's unit liaison. My mother barely slept those first days. My father went very quiet in the way certain men do when grief exceeds the emotional vocabulary they've built for themselves. I wore my dress uniform. Of course I did. Jake would have wanted that. He used to tease me about how seriously I took uniform standards, then turn around and iron his own shirts with military precision when he thought nobody was watching. Wearing the uniform felt like the most honest way I could show up for him. The problem started the night before the service. My father's side of the family began arriving from various parts of Ohio and Indiana throughout that evening. Aunts, uncles, cousins, older men from my grandfather's generation who I recognized mostly from holiday photos. The house filled up with casserole dishes and hushed conversations, and the particular uncomfortable energy that gathers in rooms where people don't know how to handle death, so they handle food instead. My Uncle Gerald arrived around 7 in the evening. Gerald was my father's oldest brother, 71 years old, a retired factory foreman who had never served in the military but had very strong opinions about it. He walked in wearing a bolo tie and immediately took up residence near the kitchen table like he was chairing a board meeting. He looked at me across the room, looked at my uniform, then looked at my father. "She wearing that tomorrow?" he asked. Not to me, to my father. My father nodded quietly. "She's active duty, Gerald." Gerald made a sound that wasn't quite disagreement but wasn't acceptance either. Then he moved on to the potato salad. I told myself it was grief. People behave strangely around death. I let it go. The next morning arrived cold and gray in that specific Ohio February way, the kind of cold that settles into your joints and stays there. I was dressed and ready by 7:30. My uniform was perfect. I'd stayed up past midnight making sure of that. Jake deserved perfect. We drove to the funeral home in 2 separate cars. I rode with my mother, who held my hand the entire way without saying anything, which was exactly right. Some people understand instinctively what comfort looks like. My mother has always been one of them. The funeral home had set up a family reception area before the formal service began. Rows of chairs arranged in concentric groupings, immediate family closest to the front, extended family arranged behind. The funeral director spoke quietly with my father about the processional order. Who would walk in when, where everyone would stand during the graveside ceremony afterward. That's when Gerald stepped forward. He spoke to the funeral director in a lowered voice, but not lowered enough. I was standing 6 feet away, adjusting my cover. "The men should be at the front for the flag," he said. "Family tradition, the women stand behind." The funeral director glanced briefly toward my father. My father said nothing. I set my cover down carefully on a nearby chair. "Excuse me," I said. Gerald turned. Up close, he had the expression of a man who had never seriously considered that his authority over a room might be questioned. "I'm the only active duty service member in this family," I said. My voice came out steady. I was grateful for that. Jake was my brother. I should be at the front with my parents. Gerald looked at me the way certain older men look at women who say inconvenient things. Patient. Slightly tired. Like he was waiting for me to finish so he could explain something to me. "It's about respect," he said. "The men represent the family publicly. That's how it's always been done." Jake didn't believe that. Jake isn't here to decide. That sentence landed somewhere painful. He didn't mean it cruelly. I actually believe that. Some people say devastating things with complete sincerity, which in certain ways is worse than cruelty. My father finally spoke. Quietly, without looking at either of us. "Let's not do this today." And because it was my brother's funeral and my mother was standing nearby with eyes already red from crying, I stepped back. I let Gerald rearrange the processional order. I let myself be moved 3 rows behind my parents, surrounded by second cousins I barely recognized, while my father and Gerald and 2 uncles I'd met fewer than 5 times took positions at the front. I want to be honest about what that felt like. It felt like disappearing. Like putting on the uniform that morning had been a gesture nobody was interested in receiving. The service itself was beautiful in the way military funerals always are. Spare and deliberate. Every movement carrying weight because someone decided it should. The chaplain spoke about service and sacrifice without making it feel like a recitation, which is harder than it sounds. A fellow soldier from Jake's unit read something he'd written himself, 3 pages in a composition notebook, hands shaking slightly the whole time. Half the room was crying before he finished the first page. I kept my face composed, not because I wasn't feeling things, because I'd learned a long time ago that in rooms full of people who underestimate you, showing emotion gets categorized as weakness before it ever gets recognized as humanity. So I held it together and stared at my brother's flag-draped casket and thought about the last phone call we had. 3 weeks before he died. He'd called to tell me about a stray dog his unit had adopted outside their forward operating base. He spent 20 minutes describing this dog's personality in elaborate detail. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. That was Jake. In the middle of everything, still finding something worth laughing about. They played taps. There is nothing in the world that sounds like taps at a military funeral. Even if you've heard it 100 times, and I had, it still does something to your chest that no other sound does. It moves through you differently when it's for someone you love. Then the flag folding began. 8 soldiers in dress uniforms moved with practiced precision. Every fold deliberate, every tuck exact. The flag that had covered my brother's casket slowly became a tight triangle of red, white, and blue. I watched from the 3rd row, partially obscured behind my Uncle Raymond's broad shoulders, and I understood with absolute clarity that I was in the wrong place. The senior non-commissioned officer carrying the folded flag turned toward the family seating area. He was a staff sergeant. Late 30s, maybe. The kind of face that's been weathered by years of outdoor fieldwork without losing its sharpness. His uniform was immaculate. He moved toward the front row with the measured, careful steps that ceremony demands. He looked at my father. Then he looked at my uncles standing nearby. Then, for reasons I still don't entirely know how to explain, his eyes moved past them. They found me in the 3rd row. He looked at my uniform, at my rank insignia, at the unit patches on my shoulder. His expression didn't change exactly, but something behind his eyes shifted in the way that it does between people who recognize each other across a room full of strangers. He walked past my Uncle Gerald. He walked past my Uncle Raymond. He walked past my father. He stopped in front of me. He held out the flag with both hands, the way the ceremony requires, and he said the words softly and precisely as trained. On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, Please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service." Nobody spoke. I could feel every set of eyes in that room shift toward me. I could feel Gerald somewhere behind me going very still. I took the flag with both hands and held it against my chest. And then something happened that I had not planned and could not stop. The tears came. Not the quiet kind. The kind that have been waiting somewhere underneath 18 months of deployment stress and professional composure and the specific exhaustion of being a woman in uniform who has learned to keep her feelings on a very short leash. The kind that come when someone finally sees you, clearly and without agenda, at the exact moment you needed to be seen. I didn't wipe them away. I just let them fall. I want to explain why that mattered so much, because it wasn't just about the flag. Growing up in my family, I was the difficult one. That was the word that attached itself to me somewhere around age 14 and never fully let go. Difficult, meaning I asked too many questions, meaning I didn't bend easily to the way things had always been done, meaning I wanted things that women in my father's family weren't particularly expected to want, like a career that required courage, like an identity built on something beyond proximity to men who had those things. When I enlisted at 21, my father's reaction was 3 days of silence followed by a single sentence. "You could have just gone to college." My mother cried, but she came around faster than anyone expected. Jake called me from his base and said, "Finally, I was starting to think I'd have to do this alone forever." Over the years, I built something real. Promotions earned, not given. Evaluations that used words like exceptional and outstanding without anyone owing me a favor. I deployed to Kuwait. I spent 8 months supporting operations in a location I'm still not permitted to name publicly. I came back each time quieter in certain ways and more certain of myself in others. The Army gave me a structure in which what I could do mattered more than what I looked like, or who my father was, or whether I made people around me comfortable. My family back in Dayton never quite knew what to do with that. They were proud in the abstract, proud in the way people are proud of something they don't fully understand and can't personally relate to, which means the pride stays at surface level and doesn't go very deep. At holiday dinners, my service came up mostly as a conversation piece. "What's it like over there? Are you ever scared? Do you actually carry a weapon?" Questions asked the way people ask about an interesting hobby rather than a life's work. Gerald had once referred to my uniform as my costume at a 4th of July cookout 5 years earlier. He'd laughed immediately after, like it was obviously a joke, and when I didn't laugh, he looked at me like I was being oversensitive. I thought about that word standing in my brother's funeral with a flag pressed against my chest. Costume. The word that had been waiting quietly in some corner of my memory, patient as a bruise. The graveside ceremony was brief and cold. Wind moved through the cemetery with a particular indifference. More words were said. More precision movements carried out. My parents stood at the front. I stood beside my mother now, because after what happened with the flag, nobody had the energy or the standing to relocate me again. Gerald didn't speak to me for the rest of the day. At the reception afterward, held at my parents' house, I moved through rooms full of relatives carrying plates of food and speaking in that particular lowered register people use at grief gatherings. People hugged me. People said kind things about Jake. One older woman from my father's church held my face in both her hands and said, "He was so lucky to have you as a sister." That one broke through a little. A cousin I hadn't seen in almost 4 years found me near the kitchen and asked quietly how I was doing. Not how was the service, how was the food, how was the drive, how was I doing? I almost didn't know how to answer because the question was so direct and so genuine that it bypassed all my professional defenses. "I've been better," I said honestly. She nodded. "That thing with the flag," she said quietly. "When the sergeant walked past everybody to give it to you." She shook her head. "I don't think Gerald has blinked since." I laughed. First time all day. It felt like something loosening in my chest. That evening, after most people had gone home, I sat on the back porch of my parents' house in my uniform with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands. The yard looked the same as it always had, the same wooden fence Jake had helped my father repair one summer when they were both briefly home at the same time. The same bird feeder my mother maintained with dedicated precision. Dead leaves pressed flat against the grass by the cold. My father came outside and sat in the other chair. We stayed quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that has texture to it. Then he said, "Gerald was wrong this morning." I looked at him. He was staring at the yard. His voice was level. "About where you should stand." I waited. "Jake would have been angry," he said, "if he'd seen that." "I know," I said. Another long silence. Then my father said something I had genuinely not expected to hear from him, not because he was a bad man, but because he was a man of his generation and his habits, who had always found emotional directness difficult. He said, "I should have said something this morning. I didn't. I'm sorry." Those words sat in the cold air between us. I didn't say it's fine, because it wasn't entirely fine. I didn't say I forgive you, because forgiveness isn't something I believe in manufacturing on demand. I said, "Thank you for saying that," which was the true thing, the thing I actually meant. He nodded once. Then we sat there together in the dark until my mother turned on the kitchen light inside and the warm glow spread across the porch, and somewhere in the neighborhood a dog barked twice and then went quiet. The months that followed were a specific kind of difficult that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. Grief has a public phase and a private one, and the private phase is longer and stranger and less supported by the people around you. I went back to base 4 days after the funeral, put my uniform back on, and walked into my office and did my job, because the job doesn't pause, and honestly, I didn't want it to. Work gave me somewhere to put the energy that grief generates when it has nowhere useful to go. Jake's absence was everywhere and specific. I'd reach for my phone to tell him something funny and remember midway through unlocking the screen. I'd hear something on the news about Afghanistan and have a half-formed thought about texting him, and then the thought would fall through. The dog from the cereal box story haunted me for months. I never found out what happened to that dog. I thought about the flag a great deal. Where it sat in my apartment, on the shelf above my desk, in a triangular display case I'd bought from a military surplus store. I'd look at it at odd moments. Early morning before a run. Late at night when I couldn't sleep. Not in a mournful way exactly. More like checking on something important to confirm it was still there. Gerald, as far as I know, never addressed what happened at the funeral. My father's family operates on a principle of not discussing uncomfortable things until they calcify into family mythology, at which point they become unreachable. I wasn't particularly surprised. I'd grown up inside that system. I understood its mechanics. What I hadn't fully understood until that day in the cemetery was how much I'd been quietly waiting for that system to see me. Not for Gerald specifically, not even for my father, though his words on the porch mattered more than I'd admitted to myself. I mean something broader than that. The version of being seen that comes from outside your own assessment of yourself. The moment when a stranger, with no obligation and no agenda, makes a decision that says, "I recognize what you are." That staff sergeant didn't know me. He had no way of knowing the history inside that room. He made a single decision based on what he observed and what he understood about service. He carried a flag across a room and placed it in the right hands, and somehow that mattered as much as anything that had happened in my 29 years of life. I've talked to other women in uniform about this, over dinners at the mess hall and during long drives between bases, and in that particular late-night honesty that happens when people are tired enough to drop their professional filters. We have different stories with similar shapes, families who valued the idea of service more than the reality of who we became inside it. Rooms where our rank was invisible until a stranger confirmed it. Moments where being seen from the outside was the thing that finally gave us permission to see ourselves clearly. I'm not suggesting that external validation should be anyone's foundation. It shouldn't. But I also think there's a difference between making something your foundation and allowing it to land when it arrives genuinely. That sergeant wasn't telling me who I was. He was confirming something I already knew and had been carrying quietly for a long time. Jake knew who I was. He always did. He was also not there to say it anymore. And that absence had its own weight, separate from grief, more like a structural shift. When the person who has always understood you most clearly is no longer available, you feel the edges of that gap everywhere. The flag lives on my shelf. I look at it every morning before I leave for work. I wear my uniform, and I do my job, and I carry whatever Jake would have wanted me to carry forward. which I believe was mostly just the commitment to showing up fully as the person I actually am, rather than the smaller version other people find more convenient. There is a particular freedom that comes when you stop auditing yourself for the comfort of people who were never really paying attention. I found that freedom in a cemetery in Dayton, Ohio, on a cold February morning, when a staff sergeant I'd never met walked past the men in the front row and brought the flag home. I am my brother's sister. I am an active duty soldier. I am the difficult one. I am all of these things at the same time, and none of them cancel the others out. Jake would have had something funny to say about all of this, something that would have made me laugh until my sides hurt and then think about for a week afterward. I don't know exactly what it would have been, but I know he would have been proud. And I know that he already was.